While Donald Trump was publicly threatening Canada with sweeping tariffs and mocking its sovereignty, a quiet shift was taking place in Europe that caught Washington flat-footed. According to reporting from Reuters and Politico, the European Union has been accelerating plans to reduce long-term dependence on U.S. defense suppliers by expanding its own military-industrial base. And in that process, Canada emerged as a preferred external partner in ways the United States did not. This matters because it signals something deeper than trade friction. It shows a breakdown of trust between longtime allies, and a realignment driven not by ideology, but by predictability. Stay with me because the context behind this decision changes how this moment should be understood. Over the past 2 years, the European Union has openly acknowledged that its defense posture is no longer adequate for current threats. This admission represents a fundamental departure from decades of transatlantic security assumptions and marks a watershed moment in how European capitals conceptualize strategic autonomy. As reported by Reuters, EU officials have been developing large-scale financing mechanisms to support domestic weapons production, including ammunition, air defense, drones, cyber systems, and space-based capabilities. These plans are designed to keep more defense spending inside Europe and reduce exposure to political uncertainty abroad. The scale of these financing mechanisms cannot be overstated. Multiple member states have committed to pooling procurement budgets, creating joint production facilities, and establishing shared research and development initiatives that would have been politically impossible just 5 years ago. The European Defence Fund, initially modest in scope, has seen its mandate expanded repeatedly, with member states now discussing contributions that would have triggered sovereignty concerns in previous political climates. The technical specifications being developed reveal the depth of this shift. European defense ministries are no longer designing systems primarily for NATO interoperability but rather for European interoperability first, with NATO compatibility as a secondary consideration. This represents a subtle but profound reordering of priorities. Ammunition calibers, communication protocols, logistics systems, and maintenance standards are increasingly being harmonized on European terms rather than being designed to seamlessly integrate with American systems. What makes this transition particularly significant is its industrial dimension. European defense contractors, long accustomed to operating as junior partners in transatlantic supply chains, are now being positioned as primary suppliers with sovereign technological capabilities. Governments in France, Germany, Italy, and Spain have coordinated industrial policies to ensure that critical components, semiconductors for guidance systems, propulsion technologies for missiles, sensor arrays for surveillance platforms, are manufactured within European borders. This isn't merely about economic benefits, it's about ensuring that production cannot be interrupted by external political decisions. At the same time, Canada began formal defense and security consultations with EU institutions in 2024 and 2025. These consultations, initially characterized as routine bilateral engagement, have evolved into something considerably more substantial. Politico and the Financial Times reported that Brussels viewed Canada as a stable, rules-based partner with compatible industrial standards and a non-coercive trade record. This characterization is revealing in what it implies by contrast. The need to specify non-coercive trade record suggests concern about partners who might leverage defense relationships for broader geopolitical or economic concessions. Canada's appeal to European strategic planners extends beyond its political reliability. The country possesses advanced capabilities in Arctic surveillance, artificial intelligence applications for defense systems, aerospace engineering, and rare earth mineral processing, all areas where European capacity remains limited. Canadian defense firms have developed technologies for cold weather operations that are increasingly relevant as strategic attention shifts northward. Moreover, Canada's regulatory environment for defense exports aligns closely with European frameworks, eliminating many of the compliance challenges that complicate other partnerships. The consultations have reportedly covered joint production agreements, technology transfer protocols, and intelligence sharing arrangements that would operate independently of existing NATO channels. This last point deserves emphasis. These are not NATO subsidiary mechanisms but parallel structures that could function regardless of NATO's operational status. Working groups have examined scenarios ranging from coordinated Arctic patrols to joint satellite constellation management, from collaborative cyber defense exercises to shared early warning systems for ballistic missile threats. What did not happen is just as important. The United States was not included in these frameworks. That exclusion was not announced dramatically. It was simply assumed. There were no press conferences, no formal notifications, no diplomatic explanations. The frameworks were designed as European-Canadian initiatives from inception, with American participation apparently never seriously contemplated during the planning phases. This absence speaks to a broader recalibration of strategic assumptions. For decades, European defense planning operated from the premise that American involvement was the default position, something that had to be actively excluded if deemed inappropriate rather than something that required justification to include. That presumption has inverted. The new default appears to be European-centered frameworks, with external participation considered on a case-by-case basis according to strategic fit and political reliability. The implications extend beyond any single partnership or procurement program. What's emerging is a layered architecture of defense relationships where the United States remains important but is no longer central to every conversation. European strategists are constructing optionality, the ability to maintain American security guarantees while simultaneously developing capabilities and partnerships that don't depend on them. This isn't abandonment of the transatlantic relationship. It's insurance against its potential failure or transformation. Several factors have accelerated this shift. Uncertainty about American political continuity has made long-term defense commitments harder to negotiate. The experience of watching critical security relationships become subject to sudden policy reversals has convinced European planners that strategic resilience requires diversification. Additionally, the realization that American defense priorities are increasingly oriented toward the Indo-Pacific rather than the Euro-Atlantic has prompted European capitals to question whether American capabilities will be available when needed, even if the political will exists. Economic considerations reinforce these strategic concerns. European governments watched as defense spending increased dramatically in response to geopolitical pressure, only to see much of that expenditure flow to American contractors. The political sustainability of higher defense budgets requires demonstrating domestic economic benefits, which necessitates European production. The Canada Partnership offers a way to expand industrial capacity and technological sophistication without defaulting back to American dependence. The quiet nature of this realignment may be its most significant characteristic. There have been no angry denunciations, no dramatic summit walkouts, no formal declarations of strategic autonomy. Instead, there has been a steady, almost bureaucratic accumulation of new institutions, agreements, partnerships, and capabilities that collectively represent a fundamental shift in how European security is conceived and organized. The infrastructure of an alternative security architecture is being built not in opposition to existing arrangements but alongside them, ready to bear more weight if circumstances require. This incremental approach serves multiple purposes. It avoids triggering the kind of transatlantic crisis that might force governments to choose sides prematurely. It allows for policy adjustments as political conditions evolve. And it creates space for the United States to remain engaged if American political dynamics shift back toward more predictable alliance management. The Europeans are, in essence, keeping their options open, something that was previously unnecessary when American engagement seemed assured. Comment below if you've seen alliances quietly shift like this without a formal break. This moment crossed a line because it challenged a post-Cold War assumption that had structured transatlantic relations for more than 3 decades. The breach wasn't merely tactical or temporary, it struck at foundational expectations about how security partnerships function among democratic allies. For decades, European defense planning was built on one premise: American leadership was reliable regardless of who occupied the White House. That assumption has weakened. This reliability wasn't simply about military capability. The United States possessed overwhelming force throughout this period. Rather, it was about predictability, consistency, and the belief that core alliance commitments transcended domestic political cycles. European defense ministries could plan decades ahead because they operated from the conviction that American security guarantees represented permanent features of the international architecture rather than policies subject to electoral revision. This assumption shaped everything from force structure to procurement timelines to strategic doctrine. European militaries designed their capabilities to complement American strengths rather than duplicate them. They specialized in niche capabilities, transport aircraft, mine clearance, peacekeeping expertise, while relying on the United States for high-end combat power, strategic airlift, satellite reconnaissance, and nuclear deterrence. This division of labor made economic sense but created structural dependencies that were politically sustainable only as long as American commitment seemed unshakable. The assumption also influenced institutional design. NATO's command structure, operational protocols, and decision-making procedures all reflected the expectation that American participation was guaranteed. Contingency plans were built around American assets arriving at predetermined times. Intelligence fusion assumed access to American collection platforms. Logistics networks depended on American transportation infrastructure. The entire system was optimized for a scenario where American engagement was the constant and European contribution was the variable. Trump repeatedly questioned NATO commitments, threatened tariffs against allies, and framed security relationships as transactional. These weren't isolated comments or momentary frustrations. According to NATO transcripts and on-the-record remarks, European leaders took those statements seriously, even when some were later softened by U.S. officials. The consistency of the messaging, across rallies, interviews, summits, and official policy statements, made dismissal impossible. This was not misinterpretation or media distortion. It was explicit articulation of a fundamentally different philosophy of alliance management. The specific nature of these statements matters. When Trump suggested that the United States might not defend allies who failed to meet spending targets, he wasn't simply advocating for burden sharing, a long-standing American complaint that European leaders had heard from multiple administrations. He was suggesting that Article 5, the collective defense provision at NATO's core, might be conditional rather than automatic. This distinction is crucial. Previous American presidents had pressed for higher European defense spending while simultaneously reaffirming that American commitments were unconditional. Trump's formulation introduced uncertainty into what had been treated as certain. The tariff threats compounded this problem by demonstrating that security relationships could be leveraged for economic concessions. The traditional understanding was that security and economics operated in separate spheres, that trade disputes might be intense but wouldn't spill over into defense cooperation. When Trump explicitly linked the two, suggesting that trade deficits might justify reduced security commitments, he collapsed that separation. European officials suddenly had to consider scenarios where economic policy decisions might trigger security consequences, or where security cooperation might be offered or withdrawn as leverage in trade negotiations. This transactional framing violated what Europeans considered foundational norms of alliance behavior. Alliances, in the traditional conception, exist precisely to remove uncertainty from security relationships. Countries accept constraints on their freedom of action, basing rights, joint planning, integrated command structures, in exchange for predictability about support in crisis. When Trump framed NATO as a protection racket where countries paid for services rendered, he transformed it from a mutual defense pact into something resembling a mercenary arrangement. The distinction isn't semantic. It determines whether allies can trust that support will materialize when needed or whether they must continuously renegotiate terms. Canada felt that pressure directly. Trade disputes escalated beyond normal commercial friction into threats against entire economic sectors. Public rhetoric hardened in ways that previous prime ministers had never experienced from American counterparts. And long-standing defense dependence on the U.S. became a vulnerability instead of a safeguard. The NAFTA renegotiation became a stress test of the broader relationship, with the Canadian government discovering that decades of military cooperation and intelligence sharing provided no insulation from economic coercion. Canadian defense planners confronted uncomfortable questions. Would American early warning systems continue to cover Canadian airspace if trade disputes intensified? Would intelligence sharing continue at current levels? Would American forces participate in Arctic security operations if the Canadian government made policy decisions Washington opposed? These scenarios had always been theoretically possible but practically unimaginable. They became imaginable. The vulnerability manifested in specific ways. Canada's fighter aircraft were aging and required replacement. The default assumption had been purchasing American F-35s, ensuring interoperability and supply chain integration. But what if political disputes led to spare parts embargoes or maintenance contract cancellations? Canadian officials began seriously evaluating European alternatives, not because they were militarily superior but because they offered diversification against political risk. This represented a fundamental shift in procurement logic. Similarly, Canadian Arctic surveillance depended heavily on data from American satellites and radar installations. The infrastructure was designed for deep integration, with Canadian and American systems essentially functioning as a single network. But that integration created single points of failure. If political relations deteriorated, Canada might find itself blind to threats in its own territory. The realization prompted investments in indigenous capabilities that were more expensive and less capable than shared systems but offered sovereign control. The psychological impact extended beyond specific capabilities. Canadian defense officials had spent careers building relationships with American counterparts, cultivating trust, establishing working procedures, and developing shared institutional cultures. The discovery that these relationships might not transcend political turbulence was destabilizing. It suggested that decades of institutional investment might not provide the strategic insurance they had assumed. If partnerships could be disrupted by presidential tweets or threatened over dairy tariffs, then the entire framework of alliance management required rethinking. What made this particularly challenging was that the threat wasn't external but internal to the alliance structure itself. European and Canadian planners weren't responding to Russian aggression or Chinese expansion, traditional threats that reinforce alliance cohesion. They were responding to uncertainty about the ally that had been central to their security for 75 years. This created a strategic problem with no clear solution. Increasing defense spending might satisfy American demands temporarily but wouldn't address the fundamental issue of political reliability. Building independent capabilities might trigger American accusations of alliance freeloading. Every option involved trade-offs with no clear optimal path. The broader implication is that trust, once damaged, is extraordinarily difficult to restore. Even if subsequent American administrations reaffirm traditional commitments, European and Canadian planners must now incorporate the possibility of future reversals into their long-term planning. The knowledge that American policy can shift dramatically means that even reliable American commitments today don't guarantee reliability tomorrow. This creates pressure for capabilities and partnerships that reduce dependence, regardless of current American assurances. This dynamic has accelerated the development of alternative security architectures. The European-Canadian consultations aren't simply hedging strategies or bargaining tactics designed to extract concessions from Washington. They represent genuine attempts to construct frameworks that can function independently if necessary. The fact that such frameworks are being developed during a period of relatively stable transatlantic relations suggests that European and Canadian officials view structural change as irreversible, regardless of who occupies the White House. If you believe institutional standards should matter regardless of politics, tap like. This was not an isolated episode. In NATO pressure campaigns, Trump publicly questioned mutual defense obligations, according to NATO summit records. Trade weaponization. Tariffs were repeatedly used against allies, not adversaries, as reported by the Wall Street Journal and Reuters. A diplomatic unpredictability, commitments were framed as conditional on short-term political leverage. European defense planners responded by diversifying risk. Canada did the same. Tell me in the comments whether you see a pattern here or just coincidental failures. The consequences are structural, not symbolic. European defense projects now prioritize suppliers seen as politically stable and contractually predictable. According to EU procurement analysts cited by Politico, long-term industrial planning depends less on raw capability and more on continuity. Canada gains options. It is no longer dependent on a single defense partner. The United States loses influence. Not through sanctions or retaliation, but through exclusion from planning tables that shape the next 20 to 30 years of defense production. No verdicts. No drama. Just lost leverage. Stay with me because this goes beyond Canada or Europe. Alliances do not collapse with speeches. They erode through unpredictability. When partners cannot rely on consistency, they hedge. When hedging becomes policy, power shifts quietly. This is what happens when negotiation turns into coercion, and when dominance replaces partnership. If you want calm, fact-driven breakdowns that explain what headlines leave out, subscribe to the channel.